Amplices. When Daddy and Jeremy James got back to the hotel, the bushy man was still sitting at the table, and his bottle was almost empty. "Did you have a good time?" he asked. "Yes, thank you," said Jeremy James. "I've been sick." "So have I," said the man. "I had a touch of overeating," said Jeremy James. "That's funny," said the man. "I had a touch of over drinking. Same thing, more or less. What a life." Daddy and Jeremy James left him sitting there. Daddy was in quite a hurry to go upstairs because the pain in his tummy had got worse, and so as soon as they'd gone into room 44, he went out again. Jeremy James sat on the bed and looked round the room. There wasn't very much to look at. There wasn't very much to do either. He bounced on the bed a couple of times, and then he went across to Daddy's bed and bounced on that, but the beds weren't very bouncy, and in any case, bouncing on beds wasn't all that interesting. The wardrobe wasn't interesting either. There was nothing in it except dust. The ceiling was boring, the walls were boring, the brown curtains were boring, the wash basin was very boring, the chair was boring. The table was boring, except on the table was the telephone. The telephone wasn't boring, no. The telephone was really interesting. Jeremy James wandered across to the table and looked at the telephone. Ever since he'd spoken to the lady hundreds of miles away, he'd been forbidden to do any more dialing. But that was at home. This telephone wasn't at home. This telephone was in the hotel. Daddy wouldn't have to pay for the bill for the telephone in the hotel, would he? Jeremy James climbed up onto the chair so that he could have a closer look at the telephone. It was a nice telephone, brown, like the curtains, and with numbers. There, for instance, was the 0 that Daddy had got him to press before he'd spoken to the bushy man. Jeremy James wondered if someone might already be talking on the telephone. There was certainly no harm in just picking it up and listening, and so he picked up the receiver. There was a humming noise. If he was to press the 0, the bushy man would say, "What a life." And it wouldn't be much fun talking to the bushy man. If you wanted to talk to somebody else, you had to press 9. That was how you got really interesting conversations. Jeremy James pressed the 9. The humming sound stopped, but nothing else happened. So he pressed 9 again. There was a click, but that was all. He pressed again. Another click. Once more, thought Jeremy James, and he pressed 9 again. It was very short. Brrr, and then a woman's voice said, "What service do you want? Police, fire or ambulance?" This was a bit of a surprise for Jeremy James because he hadn't realised he wanted any service, and now he had a choice of all three. "What service do you want, caller?" asked the woman again. "Police, fire or ambulance?" Jeremy James took his decision. "Police," he said. They'd be the most fun to talk to. "What is your name, caller?" asked the woman. That was an easy question. "Jeremy James," said Jeremy James. "Telephone number?" That wasn't such an easy question. Jeremy James didn't know. "Can you give me your telephone number?" asked the woman. That was an easy question again. "No," said Jeremy James. "What's your address then, Jeremy James?" Another easy question. "Hotel Jeremy," he said. There were some clicks, and then a man's voice came on the line. "Police," said the man. "Hello, police," said Jeremy James. "What's the trouble, son?" asked the man. This was one of those difficult questions. Jeremy James didn't know of any trouble, so he didn't answer. "I understand you're in a hotel. Is that right?" said the man. "Yes," said Jeremy James. "Who's with you?" "Nobody." "What, you're all alone?" "Yes." There was a slight pause, and then the man asked where his mummy was. Jeremy James told him that she was at home. Next he asked where his daddy was, and Jeremy James started to say he'd gone. Well, he was going to tell the man that Daddy had gone to the lavatory, but grown-ups don't like talking about lavatories, and so Jeremy James simply said, "He's gone," and left it at that. "Gone?" echoed the policeman. "He had a pain," said Jeremy James. "He had a pain and he's gone?" cried the policeman. Then Jeremy James heard him say to someone, "Ring for an ambulance, quick!" Next the policeman asked Jeremy James if he knew the number of the room he was in. Jeremy James told him it was 44. "Stay right there, Jeremy James," said the policeman. "We'll be with you in a minute." The telephone went very quiet, and so Jeremy James put it down. It was very kind of the policeman to say he'd come. That would certainly be a nice surprise for Daddy, but it seemed a bit silly to ring for an ambulance as well, because, well, they'd never be able to get the ambulance up the stairs to room 44, unless perhaps the policeman was going to take Jeremy James downstairs to look at the ambulance. Jeremy James wondered what exactly ambulances were for. He'd seen them in the street. They were big and white and sometimes flashed their lights and made loud pa-pa noises, but what did people do in them? Daddy came into the room. He was a little pale. "Daddy, what are ambulances for?" asked Jeremy James. Daddy stretched out on the bed. "What are what for?" he asked. "Ambulances." "What are ambulances?" asked Daddy. "Big white cars that flash their lights and go pa-pa," said Jeremy James. "Oh, ambulances," said Daddy. "They take sick people to hospital. What made you ask?" At that very moment there was a loud pa-pa noise from the street, and they seemed to come from right outside the hotel before they stopped. "Well, I'm blowed," said Daddy. "What a coincidence. That sounds like an ambulance arriving at a hotel. Unless it's the police. Fancy that. Just when you were asking about them." Daddy was even more surprised when half a minute later there was a knock on the door, and in came one policeman, one policewoman, and two men carrying a stretcher. "Oh," said Daddy. "Ah," said the policeman. "Hello," said Jeremy James. "You must be Jeremy James," said the policeman. "Yes," said Jeremy James. "And are you the father, sir?" asked the policeman to Daddy. "Yes, of course I am," said Daddy. "And you're not dead, sir?" "Not as far as I know." "Dying, perhaps, sir?" "No." "Slightly ill, maybe?" "Well," said Daddy, "I did have a bit of an upset stomach. Do you mind telling me what this all is about?" "Excuse me," said the one man with the stretcher, "but do you need an ambulance, or don't you?" "It doesn't look as if we do," said the policeman. "Then we'll be on our way," said the stretcher man. The two men with the stretcher left, and the policeman took out his notebook and wrote something down in it. I wish you'd tell me what's going on," said Daddy. "I think, sir," said the policeman, "that maybe your son should tell us all what's going on." Jeremy James had a strange feeling that whatever was going on should not have been going on. The policeman certainly hadn't come to play games or show him what ambulances were for, and if he were to ask now what the trouble was, Jeremy James would be able to tell him. The trouble was what Jeremy James was in. Daddy was looking at him, the policeman was looking at him, and the policewoman was looking at him, and the look with which they were looking at him had an almost magical effect on his eyes. One moment they were completely dry, and the next they were full of tears, which at once started to trickle down his face, and the magic spread to his bottom lip, which began to go all wiggly. "It's all right," said the policewoman, kneeling down beside him. "There's no need to cry." Jeremy James thought there was every need to cry. It was not only that he actually felt like crying, but also it seemed to him the more he cried, the less he'd have to explain. "I know what happened," said the policewoman. "Your daddy had a pain, didn't he?" Jeremy James nodded tearfully. "And then he went out and left you alone. Is that right?" Jeremy James nodded tearfully again. "And when he didn't come back, you thought something terrible had happened, didn't you?" Jeremy James hadn't thought any such thing, but he was getting into the swing of things now, so he nodded tearfully. "And then you rang 999 to get some help for him?" Jeremy James nodded tearfully. The policewoman stood up and rested her hand on Jeremy James's shoulder. "I think," she said, "that Jeremy James is a very clever boy. He thought his daddy was dying and he wanted to save him. Isn't that right, Jeremy James?" Jeremy James nodded, not quite so tearfully. He liked having the policewoman's hand on his shoulder. Somehow it made him feel that even if he was in trouble, trouble couldn't get to him. "That sounds very possible," said the policeman, who was then looking rather severely at Daddy. "But if that's true, sir, you shouldn't have left the little boy on his own." "Well, officer," said Daddy, "where I was going, I could hardly have taken him with me." "Then perhaps, sir," said the policeman, "you should have explained to him where you were going." "I suppose I should," said Daddy. "Next time I'll give him a blow-by-blow account. Anyway, I'm glad you're not as gone as we thought. You are, sir. And as for you, young man," said the policeman, looking down at Jeremy James, who was looking up at the policeman, We could do with bright lads like you down at the police force. So if you ever need a job, come and see us. Jeremy James' eyes dried as magically as they had moistened. Yes, please, he said. I would like a job. Well, not just yet, said the policeman. You'd better grow up first, or the helmet won't fit you. Then the policeman and the policewoman said goodbye to Daddy and Jeremy James, and the policewoman gave Jeremy James a kiss. So he gave her a big kiss in return. She'd earned it. You didn't really think anything had happened to me, did you? Said Daddy when they'd gone. Jeremy James looked at the floor. You were playing with the telephone, weren't you? Jeremy James wished he had the policewoman's hand on his shoulder again. And what have you been told about telephones? I mustn't play with them, said Jeremy James, still studying the carpet. Lucky for you had such a good lawyer, said Daddy, or we'd really have been in trouble. Now, do you promise never to play with telephones again? I promise. Right, said Daddy. Then let's have a wash and go to bed. Jeremy James would have liked to say, oh no, not another wash. But instead he said, yes, Daddy. When he'd had his washed and brushed his teeth, Daddy tucked him up in bed and turned out the light. All the same, thought Jeremy James as they lay there in the darkness, something might have happened to Daddy, and if something had happened to Daddy, he'd have been pleased that Jeremy James had dialed 999, and the policewoman would have been right to say how clever Jeremy James was. The policewoman was the nicest person in London, wasn't she, Daddy? Said Jeremy James, but Daddy was fast asleep. He'd had a very tiring day.